Welcome to Widow Dads Building Chapter 2, a Dads Left Behind podcast for young widowers who are looking for hope, support, and direction as they rebuild their lives, their faith, and ultimately create a life they want to live again. With your host, Weston Brandon.
Welcome to the Widow Dads Building Chapter 2 podcast. My name is Weston Brandon, and I am a widowed dad who built Chapter 2. This is going to be raw, unedited, unfiltered, audio only, so you might hear me sneeze in this. Okay, this is just me trying to talk to you as a fellow widowed dad about what you're currently going through, what you're going to go through, and what it might look like for you to actually create a life that you want to live again and how to be happy again. And this is not a grief therapy podcast. This isn't like, this is how you become one with yourself so that you're okay with your life the way that it is. No. Okay, when I lost my wife, I went around looking for any and all support that I could possibly find somewhere for young widowed dads. I was 23 years old. Okay, I was 23 and I had a premature infant in the NICU. And I didn't know what the hell to do with my life. I guess I should preface that. That's another thing, is because this is raw, unfiltered, you might have a cuss word here and there just because you're going to get my personality exactly the way that it is. But you're also going to get a very deep faith aspect listening to this, because I cannot talk about this journey without talking about the journey that I went on with God as well. So there's going to be a lot of practical things in here, a lot of spiritual things. So while this is primarily for Christian dads that have been widowed, if you're in a place with God that you're not sure how you feel about him, well, welcome to the club. Every single one of us that have been through this feel that way. I was extremely angry at God for a long time, was questioning whether I wanted to believe him or not. But yeah. However, if you're like, I don't believe in God at all, that's totally fine. There's going to be an episode later that's going to specifically talk about like really the faith journey part of that. I'm going to try to split it up to be a little bit more specific. So this first episode, I'm just going to tell you my story and what I went through and kind of what happened, so you get kind of the overarching view of how my life went, and you can see where I was, what happened in that crazy middle part, and what I'm doing now. And then we'll get into the specifics of how those things happened in some later episodes. So I guess we'll just dive right into it, right? I was 23 years old, like I said. My wife, Lauren, had gotten pregnant. We were excited. Our first kid on the way. I was doing really well at work. I was living just north of Dallas in a little town called The Colony. It's a suburb of the DFW metro. And I was selling mechanical engineering software, and I was doing really good at it. Sales was something I loved. I was a Latter-day Saint missionary for a long time, so knocking on doors wasn't something that I was unfamiliar with. Yes, I was one of those Mormon missionaries knocking on people's doors, okay? And I went and I took that into door-to-door sales, and I got pretty good at that, but I got married right before I did that and decided I didn't want to be gone that much, so got into the sales of mechanical engineering software, and that's what took me to Texas. When we were in Texas for a little over a year, my wife gets pregnant, and we're ready to start our family. Everything was going the way that I wanted it to. We knew where our kids were going to go to school. We had a really good church home. We had everything that we wanted there. My wife had a great job as a pharmacy tech for Kroger down there. And everything was going great until she gets diagnosed with something called an incompetent cervix, which at the time I just thought that was like a judgmental thing. That was a judgmental term. I didn't know that was an actual medical diagnosis. I thought that was more of a description, but it is. She dilated, but didn't go into labor. Okay. So she calls me at work and says, hey, something's fallen out. She was at her own job. She went to the bathroom and felt like the baby was going to fall out. So she goes up to the emergency room, gets a pelvic exam, gets diagnosed with said incompetent cervix, and is told, you're going to be on bed rest for the rest of a while until the baby comes. So this is at 25 weeks that this happened. And so, 40 minus 25, 15 weeks potentially, a couple months is what we're looking at. That was crazy. So they put her on bed rest and said, you can't get out of bed at all. You can't even go to the bathroom. You're doing a bedpan, a catheter, the whole 9 yards, right? So that's obviously a struggle for us for a week. But there wasn't anything medically wrong with her, really. Otherwise she was fine. Baby was fine. Just the door opened, and they had to keep her on bed rest so he didn't come out. But about a week later, she's getting another pelvic exam by the on-call OB, and he's coming out breech. My son is coming out breech, and they have to do an emergency C-section. So I'm working from home at the time because my house was a lot closer to the hospital than our office was, and I bust my butt, and I get up there as fast as I can, and I show up with just a few minutes to spare when they pull my son out, and he weighs 1 pound 13 ounces. And they're doing tests on him. They wrap him up in basically a big old saran wrap, some plastic wrap. Looked kind of crazy, but I was told that the betamethasol, which is the drug that they gave my wife in the IV for about a week, worked, and its purpose was to kick his lungs into gear to develop them faster. And miraculously, he didn't need to be intubated. He just needed a CPAP. At 26 weeks, that is almost unheard of. That's crazy for that to happen, at least at the time. So we kind of had this miracle baby, right? And then they did all these other tests, and he was fine. Everything was good. So essentially, they're like, he basically just needs to get to the point where he can breathe on his own, maintain his own oxygen saturation, eat everything he needs to on his own, and he needs to hold his own body temperature. Those kind of 3 benchmarks were what we were looking for. And it took him a total of 2.5 months from the time that we pulled him out to when he could go home, and he hit all those benchmarks. However, 2 weeks into that NICU journey, my wife suffers a pulmonary embolism. All of the physical trauma her body went through with the C-section, being on bed rest for that long, being pregnant, all of these risk factors made it a little bit higher risk than a normal person would have, and unfortunately she became one of those statistics. At the time, we were at my home, and she thought she was having a panic attack, and she asked me to just help comfort her, and I went and held her, and long story short, she was not having a panic attack. She asphyxiated, and I did CPR on her for a while until the EMTs arrived, and the EMTs packed her up. They got her on her stretcher, had a little machine doing CPR on her while she was on this stretcher, excuse me, and hauled her off to the hospital, and I had to follow behind. When I got to the hospital, I was stuck in a waiting room in the ICU, and there was a social worker assigned to me. I still remember her. I don't remember her name, but I remember her, and it was her job to relay information between the ICU room where all the doctors and everybody was in there working on her to me in the waiting room, and I couldn't go in there. There wasn't enough room. So she comes back and relays more information back and forth, and finally comes back to tell me that they finally have a pulse, although it's weak, but that they had been doing CPR for over 20 minutes from the time they picked her up to the time they got her here. And I knew, I was like, that's not good, right? I'm not a medical professional, but I know 20 minutes is way too long to be having to do CPR. So social worker says as soon as they get enough people out of the room that there's room for me to come in there, then they'll come get me. And should only be a couple of minutes. So she leaves again, and I'm left completely alone in that waiting room. And that was when I had my first big faith crisis. Through this journey, right? I'd had others in an earlier life that I got through, but this first one in the hospital as part of the first one of this journey was a big one. Because suddenly I was remembering everything that I'd been taught in Sunday school, everything I studied as a missionary in the scriptures, and what the afterlife, the resurrection, and all those kinds of things, right? But I didn't really know what I was thinking. I wanted a miracle. And when I needed God to talk to me, he'd either done through music or through the scriptures usually. So I had an app on my phone that had scriptures on it. It had a bunch of religious magazines and music and a bunch of other stuff on it too. I didn't really care where it opened up to, but I knelt down and I prayed and I said, God, I've had some big moments in the past, but if I never get another one the rest of my life and only get one more, I need you right now. This is the one. You cannot leave me hanging right now. Please give me something here. I don't remember the exact words I used, but something along those lines. And when I got done praying, I pulled my phone out, I opened up that app, and I closed my eyes and I just started tapping all over the screen just to see what it would randomly open up to. And it opened up to a scripture. The scripture was in the Book of Mormon, Alma chapter 40. Because I have King James version of the Bible in that app, and I have the Book of Mormon right side by side with it, and it just happened to go here. And the words in verse 1 that I saw read this. And now, my son, I have somewhat more to say unto thee, for I perceive that thy mind is worried concerning the resurrection of the dead. Now you can imagine how heavily that hit me in that moment. That God was talking directly at me. And while I didn't even realize that that's what I was freaking out about, he knew. And when I read that, I realized that too. And I read through that whole rest of the chapter, and every question that I would have would be answered in the next verse that I read. And basically, it was kind of God's way of saying, you know what the plan is. You know what Jesus has done for you. You know where she's going to be waiting for you. And you know that in the end it'll be okay, but you are just going to have to trust me. And it was kind of a way of saying it without saying it that she wasn't making it, right? And so while I felt God in that room, I felt so much love. I felt it. It was so strong, you guys. But it didn't fix my anger. It didn't fix my despair or my pain. It didn't take any of that away. It just added the immense love into the pot with all of those feelings. You know, it didn't make any of them less, less strong or less exquisite. But after that, I sat on that chair and I was just crying because I knew. And then the social worker came back to get me, and, you know, she hugged me. She was an emotional wreck too. God bless that social worker. And she took me to the ICU room, and I can't imagine what her conversation would have been like with her husband or her family or whoever after she went home from that, because that was crazy. But that's where she works. I'm sure she has lots of those conversations, right? That's why I say God bless her and people like her. But about 18 hours later, I don't know exactly how long, about 2 o'clock in the morning that following night, and this was earlier in the morning the day before, about 2 o'clock in the morning the following night, I had gotten bad news after bad news after bad news, and I had to pull the plug. I was suddenly signing papers to facilitate the donation of her organs. So the night before, my wife and I had gotten Panda Express. And we had eaten it at home after coming home from the NICU pretty late at night. It was close to midnight. And we had sat on the couch just talking about our boy. We sat on the couch just talking about the life that was coming, and even though it was difficult, that we knew that, you know, it was going to be worth it. And we were excited, man. We were excited, even though we were stressed out about our son. But everything was looking good with him, you know. I was just stressed out about how the hell I was going to pay for the NICU. You know, it's going to be $1,000 a day to keep him in there. But I went from that one night to the very next night, I'm signing those papers. And I'm in an operating room with her, and there's 2 surgeons scrubbed up. And she's hooked up to some monitors, and I walk in that operating room. And I remember them looking at me, and I couldn't see their faces because they're behind the masks, but I could see their eyes and how focused they were, but how I don't even know a word. Like how do you describe that? If you're that surgeon and you see this kid, 23 years old, in your operating room and his wife's laying on the table in front of you. I don't know how to describe what that looked like, and I'm sorry if I'm going too heavy, but if you're a widowed dad and you've lost your wife, then I know you can appreciate this. And that while it might be hard for you to hear, and I'm sure that you're thinking of your own experience losing your wife, and it's bringing the waterworks like it is for me, that you remember it's still, in some way, it feels good to feel, even if it hurts sometimes. And if you're listening to this and you're really, really fresh into it, and you've lost your wife just in the past, couple of weeks maybe, I want to give you this warning that it's going to continue to hurt, and it's going to continue to hurt real bad for a while. But as you continue to go, it's easy to kind of get numb to that feeling and to not be able to feel really anything at all, to where you're just floating. And you might go visit the cemetery just because you know it'll make you feel again. And the struggle is that I can't feel anything, but when I do feel something, it's pain and sorrow. And I remember that. I remember that phase really well. So, again, if you're a widowed dad and you're kind of in that phase, and this makes you feel, and you have this weird way of like, I enjoy this because it makes me feel, even though it makes me feel hurt and pain and sorrow. Hopefully it also makes you feel seen and understood to some level. So after that, one of the miracles that happened was my parents had already had flights to come down. They live in Utah, where I am now. I've moved back a few years ago. But my parents were flying down to come see my son, and the very date and flight times that they had booked their flights, a couple weeks in advance, they just so happened to land after I had been in the hospital with my wife for a couple of hours. So as I left that operating room, I looked at my wife one more time, and I just told her, I'll see you soon. And I gave her a kiss on the forehead, and I told the surgeons in there, you can let her go now. And I walked out of those double doors to that operating room, and I turned around and I watched them shut the machine off. And I just kept my eyes on my wife's face as those doors closed. And then those doors closed and latched. And I had a long, lonely walk down a long, white hallway out to the main lobby of the hospital. And I screamed the F word, and I punched the tile wall. But I didn't cry in that moment for some reason. Because I had spent the entire day up to that point sobbing all day long. I didn't have any more crying left in me. I just punched that tile wall, and I started walking down the hallway. And I came out, and my parents were waiting for me, and they asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, I want to go see my son. So I hopped in their car, and they drove me up to Baylor, Scott and White, and McKinney. We had been at Plano Presbyterian, so we had about a 45-minute drive or so, I don't remember exactly, up to Baylor, Scott and White in McKinney, Texas. And we walked into that NICU, and the NICU nurses, God bless their souls, were amazing people. But they had kind of gotten used to our routine, right? I'm working all day, my wife's recovering, and then after I get done working, we grab a bite to eat, and then we go up to the NICU. So we were usually showing up to the NICU about the same time during the day, right about the shift change time when the night shift nurses were coming in, And so they're used to our routine by that point, because it's been two-ish weeks at that point. So when I show up at 3 o'clock in the morning, I go up to that NICU and I hit the buzzer. They got a camera there so they can look, and they know me, so that they don't even ask. They just open the door. So I hear the door buzz, and I push through the door, and the nurse that had been at the station that saw me and opened the door, she came walking down the came walking down the hallway, with a concerned look on her face, and she's like, "What are you doing here?" And she could tell something was wrong, and that poor nurse loved my wife, She had a relationship with her, and I had to drop that bombshell on her. And then I had to drop that bombshell on every other nurse that came in that didn't get the message, of like, what the hell is he doing here right now? And me and my parents just got in there, and I had them grab my son, and I took my shirt off, and I held my tiny, less than 2 pounds, actually, he might have been just barely over 2 pounds then. I grabbed my tiny, just over 2 pound son and held him on my chest and tried to fall asleep. And I was so exhausted at that point. I think I did finally fall asleep maybe an hour into that, and then woke up as the sun was kind of coming through the window a little bit, maybe around 6 in the morning, and knew I had to get home. I had some things to take care of, so I put my son back, and I told my parents to take me home. And we drove back to my house, and it was coming back home from the hospital that I had my biggest moment. And when my parents parked in front of my house, and I looked at the front door of my house, the realization that my wife was no longer there hit me as I was walking up those steps, and I collapsed right there on walking up the steps to my house. And I kind of had a little breakdown right there, and my dad had to pick me up. And I need you to envision, my dad's as tall as I am. He's 6'3", I'm 6'2", but I'm bigger than he is. I weighed about 250, and my dad weighs probably 200, and he had to basically pick me up off the concrete there, get me to stand up and walk into my house. And my parents brought in their suitcases. They're going to stay for a week or so, and then they're like, what do we do? And I just told them, like, guest bedroom's down there. You guys can go in there. And then I walked into the master bathroom of my bedroom where my wife had collapsed. And there is where it all came crashing down. And I collapsed there, and I screamed and I cried for I don't know how long. And I remember the thoughts swirling in my head while I was on the floor in the fetal position on the tile, thinking of all of the bad things that I'd done as a teenager, growing up, how I had always been scared to death that no woman would ever love me, that I would never get married. All these bad self-esteem issues I had growing up, and I started all these dark thoughts of all the dumb things that I'd done were swirling through my mind, and I remember thinking, am I being punished for this? My wife was a miracle. I wasn't sure if I'd ever find somebody who would want me, and then I did, and she was so perfect, and our relationship was so amazing. We were so in love, and then she was taken. And I was like, dude, I hate being alone. Even the day after she died, I knew. I was like, pardon my French, but son of a bitch, I'm going to have to go through all this process again. And I remember being so angry about that and how I didn't want to. And the very thought of thinking of somebody else made me nauseous. Made me sick. Because it wasn't who I wanted. But I logically knew that I was going to have to do that if I ever wanted to be happy again. Even the day after she died, those were some of the thoughts swirling through my mind. And I hated those thoughts, and I tried to push them away. And I finally didn't have any more crying left, and I fell asleep for a minute on the tile floor until my body was hurting enough to wake me up, and I got up and climbed into my bed, and I slept for I don't know how long, man, but I was out. And then, dealing with all the funeral arrangements, and our church home was awesome. People bringing over meals, taking care of us. My in-laws were there, and, we had to go through this whole process of figuring that all out. So the first real estate purchase I ever made was a burial plot in American Fork Cemetery in Utah. And actually, I didn't even pay for it. One of her cousins, that was what he bought those for us. He just asked us where we wanted them. But my first real estate ownership was a burial plot in a cemetery. And we flew up to Utah and buried her there. Kind of a good central location for all of our family. And then flew back to Texas again, and my son's still in the NICU. So then for 2 more months, it was just me and him. You know, like family would come and go, but you just feel so completely alone and abandoned by everyone. And it's such a weird thing. And if you're a family member of a young man who's lost his wife, and you want to know what to do, the only thing I can tell you is just be there. Be present, be available, but don't try to push. Because that man is going through an overhaul in every sense of the word. And you can't do anything about it, but you can be available. As long as he knows that you're available and that you want to help, and he's aware of what you can do to help, then when he's ready for it, he can come around to that. Because he's still going to feel alone even if you're there. You can't change, you can't fix that loneliness feeling when you've lost the person you love the most. So, I digress. I spent 2 months in the NICU alone with my son. And my mental health was going down, spiraling. And I remember being angry. So angry. I was angry that I felt like the choice to take my own life was not an option. I didn't even have the choice because my son had survived. That's how dark my thoughts were getting. That I wished my son had died with my wife so that I wouldn't have anything tying me here and that I could take my own life to follow my wife to the other side so I could be with her there. That's how nasty that was getting. If those thoughts are what you're dealing with, first of all, please understand that I understand. And that those will not last forever as long as you focus on creating and maintaining authentic human connection with the people that you care about. I learned this from one of the NICU nurses there. Her name was Bev. And I share this story. I go speak to healthcare associations now. I speak to nursing associations all over the place. And this story of Bev is like the anchor story to that whole keynote. Because she changed my life, and the nurses there changed my life. They were phenomenal, which I know is not the norm, but I got lucky with some amazing nurses. The thing that Bev taught me was that if I wanted to create a real connection with my son, if I wanted to really feel like his dad, then I needed to put some real effort into learning as much about him as I possibly could. Because I denied them, I denied holding him after my wife died for a while. You know, that first night I did, but then in the days back, it took me a couple days to go back. And when I did, I didn't want to hold him. I didn't really know why. I just didn't feel like it. I was like, no, you can keep him in the incubator. You guys are the professionals. You got this, right? And I kept denying him. I denied probably 10 or 15 times. And then Bev, finally, she comes over. I'm sitting in that stupid teal green leather, awfully uncomfortable rocking chair in that NICU room. And any dad that's ever been in a labor and delivery unit or a NICU unit knows the chair I'm talking about. Because I swear every single hospital in the entire country has that chair. And I'm sitting in that chair. And she comes over to me and she puts her hand on my knee and she says, Weston, I'm not a widow. I can't tell you that I know what you're feeling. However, you need your son, and your son needs you. And when you're ready to put some effort into that, you let me know. And then she got up and walked out. Now, she had earned the right to say that because she had built a relationship with me up to that point. I trusted her. I knew that she really cared about us and our family. Because if that was a stranger telling me that, I might have punched him in the face. But thank God for Bev being brave enough to say that, because when she said that, I realized, I'm like, oh my gosh, what is wrong with me? Probably a lot, but what's going on in my head, And having been so involved in sales and done mindset training and done all this kind of stuff, like I prided myself on having good control of my own thoughts, and mental work and all these kinds of things. And so I realized, I'm like, oh man, I got some work to do. So what is going on in my head? And I sat there and I meditated and I prayed and I tried to dig into my head, figuring out what the heck is going on with me. And the best that I could figure, when I was asking myself, why don't I feel connected to my son? Why did Lauren, my wife, have such a deep connection with him already that I didn't have quite what she had? The best I could come up with was that she grew him inside of her, right? And she had just got to the point where she could start feeling him moving before this happened. And after he came out, she was, 100% involved. And I was kind of staying in the background a little bit, like, yeah, let mom do this. This is mom's time. This is mom's zone, And most of the nurses were focusing on teaching mom anyways. So I just the best thing I could come up with was that she had the experiences necessary that created that connection. And I didn't. So if I was going to create those experiences, then that was on me. That was going to be that's within my control, right? So once I kind of had this epiphany, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's up to me. That's my fault. I got to do this. I got up out of that chair and I walked over to Bev at the nurse's station. I says, all right, give him to me and I'm going to take him as much as you'll possibly let me have him. And you'll probably have to pry him off of me because I want to hold him. And the truth is, there was still something to me that didn't really want to, but I knew that if I wanted to, I had to do it in order to feel like I wanted to. And so I started holding him. And over the coming weeks, Bev taught me that if I wanted to create that connection, I had to learn more things about him, right? So I remember one time coming to the NICU that he was squirming and fussing and they had just fed him. They changed his diaper. So 23-year-old naive me is like, why else would a baby be crying if he's 8 and he's got a diaper change? Like, what else is there? And she just chuckled and she's like, well, maybe he's in a bad mood and you can, help him feel better. So I got him out of the incubator and I was holding him and trying to get him to calm down. He was still fussing around and having a fit. And so I experimented with some music and I found what kind of music he liked, what calmed him down. And I remember when I learned that, and I was like, oh man, I played El Paso by Marty Robbins, an old 1950s gunfighter Western song. And he calmed right down. I'm like, oh man, yeah, we can vibe with this. Okay. So then, I learned something about him and I immediately feel that connection with him. That was the biggest thing that I got out of my NICU journey. So that by the time I was graduating the NICU with my son, I still wasn't great mentally, but I was at least on an upward trajectory. I was on the uphill, right? So after I leave the NICU, now it's time to figure out now what, right? Now what do I do with my life? What's going to happen? And I realized that all of the people that were capable of helping me and that wanted to help me were not in Texas. Most of them, all my family, they were all back in Utah, and I needed to go somewhere where I was supported. So shout out to Robin, who was my landlady at the time. She let me get out of my lease without losing my security deposit given the situation. And I took off and I moved back to Utah. And I moved back into my parents' basement, into the bedroom that I lived in when I graduated high school. Like all the way back to square one is what it felt like, And it was there that I started getting really, really angry. Angry at the world, angry at God that I was back in this situation. I felt one of the biggest things I felt like I lost was my freedom. I loved my kid, but now I have to ask my mom's permission to go out again if I don't want to take my son. Because somebody's got to watch him. It's like all these things that new parents go through, you usually go through together, but I went through alone. I had to figure it out by myself, and I hated it, I'll be honest. And I feel ashamed saying that, but I hated that. And I was so angry. But I was doing a lot of praying. And I know that I said we're going to talk more about the faith journey part, but this is relevant, these little details here. I remember praying and asking God, I'm like, if you're going to do this, you better have something worked out. You better have somebody lined up. You better, whatever life's going to look like what the freak. How dare you take it and not have it ready to go? Something else or something. I don't know how I was saying it, but That was kind of the gist of my prayers, screaming at him for a while. And I remember one night, like 2 o'clock in the morning, because the babies, they'll wake up in the middle of the night to feed them. The NICU got him on a schedule every 3 hours, and he maintained that schedule. So 2 o'clock in the morning, I feed him and I burp him and I get him down, get him back to sleep. And I'm sitting on the edge of my bed and I'm angry again. And I say another prayer, super mad. And after this one, I felt something different. And the words came to my mind: I can't give you the miracles you're looking for if you're sitting in your mother's basement. Wow. Okay. So I got to get off my butt and make some stuff happen. If I want to fix myself and then I eventually want to find another young woman and I want to get remarried, then I'm going to have to do some stuff, right? So I was also very blessed that a good friend of mine, Jason Wooten, shout out to Jason if you're listening to this, buddy. He was a neighbor in my parents' neighborhood, and he ran his own therapy practice. He's a LCSW, licensed clinical social worker. And he specialized in his personal therapy stuff. He specialized in grief and addiction. And I'm like, well, yeah, let's chat, right? So I started doing therapy with him just at his house, and he did it for free for me for a little while, and I started paying him a little bit later. And he helped me to realize a lot of things about my mental health and how my grief was opening up other wounds that I had that were always there, but they're just kind of buried under my ego and stuff. And realize a bunch of other issues that I had to work on. And as I started working on some of those and like actually getting a good perspective on those, I actually felt like I was gaining control of my mind again, feeling a lot better about that. So then I went back and, I was again a little bit on more of an uphill trajectory, but still angry, still so angry and depressed and stuff. But I guess maybe not as depressed, or I felt a little bit better equipped, even though I was depressed. I don't know how to describe that, but I remember just still praying again. None of my prayers were nice during that time. And again, it was like, kind of came again. It was like, dude, I can't answer your prayers if you're being like Jonah and hiding in the boat. If you're just tucking yourself away. And so I was like, all right, I gotta, if I remember the thought came to me one night I was praying, if I want this to happen, if I want to find somebody again, and this is months later, if I want to find somebody again, then I got to put myself in an environment where God can make that miracle happen. Where if there's somebody out there that would be really good for us, that we would be really compatible, that God can kind of guide us together so that we can at least meet, then I got to put myself in a situation where it would be easier for her to meet me. Right? Like, that seems logical, so dumb, but it was like this big epiphany to me at the time. I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, of course. So I started going to young adult hangout activities that our church was doing, and to be honest, I hated every minute of it. I didn't like any of that, because even though I was 23 years old, I had this tiny little baby, and I felt like I was emotionally ancient compared to everybody else my age. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to train somebody on how to be emotionally mature before I get in a relationship or something, probably some of my ego coming through again at the time. But that was what I was thinking. And so I gave up on doing these activity things, and I downloaded a dating app instead. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to throw a profile up, and I'm going to put pictures of me and my son and kind of just give the context of the situation that we're in and see who's crazy enough to swipe on that. And then I started swiping through all the other profiles of these ladies on this dating app, and I said no to every single one in the entire app, in the entire region, or whatever it sorts them at. And I got to the end and it said, there's no more options or whatever. And I'm like, well, kind of look up to God. I'm like, hey, I tried, told you, you got to do something else. And then I had this moment of realization, probably the Spirit of God talking to my mind or something, but just a little bit of clarity came, and I was like, dude, you said no because it's not who you were looking for. You're looking for Lauren. You're looking for your wife, and she's not in there. And that's not fair to you, and it's not fair to the other ladies on there that are looking for somebody. I was like, gosh dang it. All right. I got to go do it again. And that just made me nauseous. So I got digging around. And it turns out there's a premium version of the app you could pay $20 a month for, and it would just tell you if somebody swiped on your profile, and you could just look at only the ones that swiped. Save yourself a bunch of time, right? I'm like, there we go. Take my money. I don't even want to look at this. Paid for the premium version. And then I had like this anxiety attack about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't even want to know. So I disabled notifications, and I didn't look at it for a while. I was too scared to look at it, and I was like, nobody's going to swipe on that. Nobody, who's either they're batshit crazy, or basically that's probably it. They're probably batshit crazy if they swipe on this, and they're just swiping on everybody, But finally, a little while later, I finally did look at it, and there were 5 women that had swiped on that. And I realized that I now had a new problem. I had to figure out if they were batshit crazy, or I have to figure out if they were really, really cool, really emotionally intelligent, had experienced some things themselves, So I was like, all right, I guess I got to talk to them. So I messaged them and then started having conversations, and I was blown away by the quality of conversations I was having with these women. The vast majority of them, not that there was a ton, like I said, there was like 5, maybe 6 or something. And I felt like having good conversation, but I also didn't like trust myself to really be able to see through and see the character super well. So I was like, I don't know how this is going to go. And I still felt so weird about the whole thing, but I eventually came to the realization, I'm like, I'm just going to have to meet these people in person to kind of figure this out. So I set up a couple of dates, and the very first one I went on a date with is my wonderful wife, Kearsley, the mother of 3 more of my children. Miraculous, right? Now, I didn't know that she was going to be my wife when we first went on a date, but we go on this date. We went to Texas Roadhouse, and then the fad going on right at the time was hatchet throwing. Everybody's doing hatchet throwing, so we went and did that after dinner, and we still wanted to spend some time together, so we kind of made up other stuff to do after that. We went to Cold Stone, took her for a spin on my motorcycle, stuff like that. And at the end of this date, when we decided we were going to split up and go home, we set up another date for a couple of days later. And as she was driving away, before I'd went on this date, I had said another prayer. Because again, I'm still mad about being in this situation. And I said, whatever you took my wife for, whatever you've got her doing on the other side that you think is so important that she needs to be there instead of here, if I have any authority as her husband, I'm going to call in some PTO, damn it, and I need her to come with me to give me a green light or a red light, because I don't trust my own judgment. This is what I was thinking. So at the end of this date, I sat on my motorcycle again before I put my helmet on, and I was like, wow, that was really fun. Like, I enjoyed that. And it feels weird to enjoy that again with somebody else. So I said out loud, talking to my late wife, Lauren, I said, babe, what do you think? And I tell you, the feeling that hit me like a ton of bread, like just goosebumps across my whole body, and this warm feeling came across and kind of made me a little bit misty-eyed, basically was a green light. I didn't feel like I was told, you need to marry her. I personally don't believe in that. I don't think that that's a thing, but I got a green light. Like, you can trust her, like, don't be so trepidatious around her and worried all the time. Like, she's a good one. So I was like, wow, okay, cool. So then we went on our second date, and after our second date, it's when we had our conversation that we're really enjoying this, and we're gonna be a thing. We're gonna make this steady. We're gonna be exclusive. So I had a couple of other dates scheduled for a little bit later in some of those other conversations, and I just messaged the other ladies, and I respectfully told them, hey, I'm going to pursue this route because I found something that I want to try, and I don't want to waste your time. So thank you for the good conversations, and best of luck. And I got some messages back like, oh my gosh, I usually get ghosted. Thank you for telling, all those kinds of things. And anyway, cut ties with all the rest of them and dated Kearsley exclusively. And we ended up having conversations about marriage accidentally. We didn't even mean to have that conversation. My wife Kearsley came from an abusive relationship with her previous husband. And she had gotten divorced. And then she had served a church mission just like I did after that. And had come back and had not had good luck in the dating scene. But because she had experienced being divorced, she was a lot more open to dating men who already had kids or who had been in previous relationships and stuff. And as she was telling me some of the details of what she went through with her ex-husband, I remember thinking, I'm like, my gosh, I can't wait to show you what a healthy relationship looks like. Because me and Lauren had it good. We very rarely fought. We had a couple of disagreements, mostly about dogs, but that was kind of it. And that thought came to my mind. I was like, I can't wait to show you what a good, healthy relationship looks like. Not an abusive one. Except what happened was that phrase accidentally started coming out of my mouth, and I had to bite my tongue halfway through. I'm like, dude, what are you saying? You can't say this right now. We haven't even been dating for that long. And she knew exactly where I was going with that, and she pulled it out of me. She's like, can't wait to what? What are you going to say? And she pulled it out of me. And I finally said, I was like, all right, fine. You know what? Here it is. Where do you see this going? And we came to the conclusion that if it continues on the trajectory that it currently is, as long as no deal breakers come up, something that we don't know about each other, then logically we would end up getting married at some point. So we're like, all right, well, let's have the deal breaker conversation then. Let's get every ugly detail about our entire past out, everything that we've ever had to repent for, everything we've had to apologize for, everything, all the stupid things that somebody could maybe come try to stab us in the back about, like, but did you know this about your husband, or did you know about this about your wife, or whatever. And we got all of it out, every detail, and there were some tears shed. That was a couple hour long conversation, but at the end of that, we're like, okay, there it is. There's everything. Any deal breakers? And we're like, well, some of that's some heavy shit, honestly, but no deal breakers. I'm good with that. And so then we're like, so does that mean we're engaged now? Is that what this means? We're like, I guess. Is it like stage 1 of being engaged? I'm like, dude, it's been a little while since I went through this process. I don't remember how to do this. And so then we just decided, like, yeah, we're going to get married eventually. And so we kind of like started ring shopping around and kind of figuring that out. And the next thing I'm going to share with you about our journey, I need to preface this with, I have really good relationships with my in-laws, with Kearsley's parents and her family. They're great people. Amazing people, and we go there. We take our kids there for Sunday dinners and for holidays and stuff. So, what I'm going to share, I'm not going to share their names or anything like that, but I'm going to share just enough detail that you can understand the emotional gravity of what was going on, and try my best not to show them any kind of disrespect in doing this, because, like I said, we're good now. Like, me and my father-in-law have literally looked each other in the eye, shook hands, and said, I forgive you. I'm sorry for how much of a jackass I was, and all those kinds of things, okay? So I just got to put that out there as like a caveat to this quick little story I'm going to share. My in-laws, Kearsley's parents, were worried sick about her. And didn't go good. There was a lot of drama around us and our desire to get married, and people saying, well, you can forget about me coming to the wedding. I don't think you should marry him, and this, that, and the other, crazy stuff that was extremely difficult for my wife to deal with. It was a heavy emotional time. And then some other family members telling her like some crazy, unfounded Christian doctrine about how, like, well, because he was married to her, when you guys get married and when everybody's resurrected, she can kick you out, and like the wildest stuff, right? Like, dude, point in the Bible where it says that. Like, are you kidding me? Like crazy things. People telling her, like, you can't let him talk about Lauren ever again. Like, it's got to be you can't have any pictures. Like, don't even tell his son about her. Like, you are mom until he's 18, then tell him when he's 18. Like, stupid shit, right? And we had a lot of drama to deal with. And then there was extended family of Lauren's that had a hard time for a minute, But like I said, same there. I have great relationships with all of them. I am lucky that, none of those were eternally screwing up our relationships, kind of a thing. Because we still go to the family Christmas parties and those kinds of things. So, Lauren's extended family, Kira's extended family, if you hear this, I love you guys to death. But we can agree that it was bumpy there for a minute while you guys were wondering how crazy I was. And to be fair to anybody listening to this, any widowed dads, it's fair for people to be worried about you. It's fair for people to question your motives a little bit, but they still have to let you make your decisions to make your decisions. Right? There's a lot of advice out there that you need to wait a year before you make any big decisions. Screw that, okay? That is terrible advice. You'll hear that from a therapist who's never been widowed. It does not happen. If you're lucky enough to get life insurance, I wasn't. We were actually in process of doing life insurance paperwork when my wife died, so I didn't get any life insurance. I got a little supplemental life insurance from her employer that was like a year's worth of her salary that covered basically the funeral costs and to get me moved back to Utah. I didn't have anything else beyond that. Like, there are going to be decisions that you're going to make less than a year. And let me share some statistics with you, okay? There's been studies done on widows and widowers, and at the bottom of this podcast episode, now that I'm thinking about it, I'll try to cite where I'm getting this data from, but I had to do all this studying, when I was setting up doing coaching for widowed dads and speaking about it. Like, you got to cite your stuff, right? But in a period of 24 months, the percentage of widowed men who have entered another committed relationship, whether that's dating exclusively or married, doesn't matter, another committed relationship at the 2-year mark after they lost their spouse. You want to know what percentage of widowed men are in that boat, in another committed relationship? Just over 60%. Okay, well over half of us have found whatever our chapter 2 relationship is after 2 years. So if that many have successfully found that, then logic would stand to reason that a lot more than that are actively pursuing it and just haven't quite locked it down yet. I mean, I don't really know any metrics for that, but if 61% are successful, then I wouldn't be surprised if it's 80 or 90% have either done it or are currently trying to. Men remarry quickly. That's widely known. Now, you will get a lot of crap for it. Or you might, at least. I did. Okay? I remarried about a year after my wife passed away. That rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. A lot of people thought I was completely dishonoring Lauren. A lot of people thought I was completely dishonoring her memory and everything, and that I was just looking for a babysitter, going so far as to say stupid things like, you're just being able to, missing having sex, and you just want to be able to do that, right? Like, people will say the dumbest stuff. Now, the flip side for widows, for the women, it's a lot less than that. I don't have the citations in front of me, but when I was doing it, for some reason, the number like 20 or like 30 something % is coming to my mind. That one, don't quote me on. I'm just trying to pull it from my memory, but it was like half the amount of widows at the 2-year mark than widowers. So I just say that for some context, right? That in my experience, I've been in these widows and widowers circles for 7+ years now. Most of them religious-based. And from my own experience, going to these conferences, getting to know these people, being in the Facebook groups and all those kinds of things for this long, I can confidently tell you that from my perspective, the vast majority of widowed dads are actively thinking about how to get dating again and getting remarried, and like that's a heavy thought on their mind within 6 months. The vast majority of us, those conversations are happening, those thoughts are swirling. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a lot sooner than that. Because like I said, the day after, the thought was crossing my mind, even though I pushed it away. And I forced myself not to think about that for a long time. For weeks and weeks, right? I met Kearsley little over, 5 months later? 5 months after my wife passed away is when we met. And then when we got married was about at the year mark. Close to. It's pretty quick. I'll be honest about that. It's pretty quick. It's not the quickest I've seen. But your timeline is up to you. The one thing I will tell you is that you will never feel ready. The men that I've talked to that wait until they feel ready will wait until they die. And then there are the men who dive in way too fast. You know, there's a whole identity crisis that goes with losing your wife, because who are you fighting for now? You got to have your maiden to fight for, right? That's our whole purpose on this planet, is to provide and protect. So if we don't have our woman to provide and protect for, then what good are we? And that's very valid questions, but some guys jump into it too fast. The only thing that I will say is that as long as you keep your mind and your heart open to changing your perspective and changing the way that you think, changing the way that you react, as long as you're actively working on that and you can be really authentic and honest with yourself about what you're feeling and why, and you can talk to people about that, and you're not lying to yourself, if you're authentic to yourself, then you are ready to take steps forward. That doesn't mean you're ready to get married tomorrow, but it means you're ready to take steps forward. You got to talk to a therapist. You got to get some of that, mental, emotional damage worked out. There's got to be some healing there for sure, okay? Absolutely. But once you get to a point where you feel like I'm not perfect, but I am making a lot of progress, I now feel more connected to myself than I ever have, then you are ready to make that decision if you're going to enter the dating field or not. And I would encourage you to do so, because the life that you want is on the other side of everything that you're afraid of. And it is not going to be a comfortable process, but it will be the most rewarding process that you have ever gone through in your entire life. And that is a promise. Not just coming from me, but that's also all of the guys that I've talked to at the conferences and the Facebook groups and everything that have done this, that have gotten remarried, that have gotten more kids, that look back at their life. And they're like, I would never agree to have that happen again. I can't say that I'm necessarily glad that it happened. Like, that's a dumb thing to say. But I will say that I wouldn't change it, because I love the life that I have now. And I'm so lucky that I'm married to another wonderful woman that my kids love, that maybe I have more kids, and that my late wife, God rest her soul, is still an active part of our family. That I kind of have too, in a way, I mentioned I was a Mormon missionary, so if you want to use some dark humor, you could joke that I'm a real Mormon. I got two, on my headstone, there's 2 women's names on there. That's some dark humor. Okay, but I'm saying it because the intended audience for this podcast is men who would understand that kind of humor. So, thus kind of ends the cliff notes of my story and getting remarried. In the next episode, we're probably going to be talking about the career changes that you're going to have to make, because that was the next big step in my journey. Was what do I do about my job? Most guys have to figure that out before they get remarried. I'll be honest. I kind of did it backwards. I was on FMLA leave for a long time. Okay. But the two most common things that the young widow dads go through in this whole process to build chapter 2 is something about their job changes and something about their living situation changes. Whether they move to a new house in a completely different city, or like me, a completely different state, or they go to a new role at their job, or they change careers entirely like I did. I left sales and I got into blue-collar work. Doesn't matter. Whatever it was, we all have to make some big changes. So thank you for being here, guys. Thank you for listening. And to the other widow dads out there listening to this, whether these episodes have been live for a few years now, or if you're listening to it when this is still barely brand new, I love you, bro. I see you. God sees you, even if it doesn't feel like it. And a happy life that you actually enjoy living is within reach. I'm going to tell you how I did it for me. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next one.
This has been an episode of Widow Dads Building Chapter 2, a Dads Left Behind podcast for young widowers with your host, Weston Brandon. Thanks for listening.